Welcome to the second lecture of the Institute for Philosophy and Religion's annual fall lecture series, The End of the University. I'm David DeCosimo. I'm director of the Institute and associate professor here in the School of Theology. The Institute for Philosophy and Religion was founded over 50 years ago by a group of philosophers, scholars of religion, and theologians who had been, among other things, teachers of Martin Luther King Jr. when he was doing his PhD in systematic theology here at BU School of Theology. And 50 years ago, as they conceived the idea for this institute, they wanted to ensure that the university would be a place where people could, with maximal rigor and thoughtfulness and seriousness, continue to talk about the most important things, could continue to address and consider together the kinds of fundamental human questions that lead people to fall in love with philosophy, that drive people to religious faith, that inspire people to take up the work of theology. In the face of the increasing specialization they saw in the university, they wanted to maintain and continue a legacy of asking these kind of humanistic questions. And who knows whether they could have foreseen that proposition, the proposition that there are common questions rooted in human experience across the depth of our difference and in the midst of all our unique particularity, that proposition is one that is kept alive in the Institute. At the heart of the Institute really is the effort to, in the best of company and with maximal seriousness, ask and pursue together these kinds of questions. And that brings us to the topic of the lecture series and to today's lecturer. The aim of our series, The End of the University, is to step back and to look together at this institution, the university, and to ask one another and to think collectively about what this institution is for. Why is there such a thing as a university? What is this thing and the practices that constitute it? What is it made for? What is its end? What is its purpose? What ought its purpose to be? So the popular intellectual Malcolm Gladwell recently noted that Princeton University has become the first perpetual motion machine in human existence. And what he was naming by that was the reality that Princeton's endowment is now so great that each year it brings in almost $4 billion, and its operating expenses, what it costs to run the institution, to pay faculty, to maintain everything, is only $2 billion. So each year, they're able to add, from here on out, at least $2 billion more to their endowment. It is perhaps the wealthiest thing that has ever existed in the history of the world, and it's a university. What is this thing for? At the same time, the end of the university, in terms of asking about whether this institution can, notwithstanding places like Princeton, whether it can continue to survive amidst the political entanglements and conflicts that mark American society, amidst the battles over culture and meaning that we've seen unfold over the past 10 and 5 years, and amidst economic downturn and changes in demography, wherein many smaller institutions will struggle even to fulfill entering classes. And then finally, what is the relationship between these things, between the purpose of the university and its endurance and whether it can survive? I can think of no one better to help us think about these questions and their intersection than our distinguished lecturer today, Dr. Hrishikesh Joshi, who is assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy at Bowling Green State University. Dr. Joshi received his PhD in philosophy at Princeton University, and from there, he worked for several years as a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Michigan and their distinguished Department of Philosophy. Prior to his philosophical career, Dr. Joshi received a summa cum laude bachelor's degree in aeronautical engineering at USC. So he brings to the table both this depth of philosophical training, but also engagement with the world of STEM, which is so central to the existence of universities today. He's an ethicist who works across the field of moral philosophy, but especially it has expertise in PPE, philosophy, politics, and economics. And despite only having finished his PhD in the past several years, he's already published 7 articles in outstanding philosophy journals such as Analysis, Philosophical Studies, and Public Affairs Quarterly. And he is the author of this book, Why It's Okay to Speak Your Mind, published by Routledge Press. Now, in all honesty, rarely have I encountered a book that at one and the same time is eminently accessible, addresses an enduring and extremely important question and topic, and is brimming with creative arguments and philosophical insights that once you encounter them, leaving you thinking, why didn't I think to say that, on the one hand, and seeming so true that you find yourself wondering how we ever got along without these arguments and insights to begin with. It's an experience that I think many readers also have in reading John Stuart Mill's On Liberty for the first time. And the fact that that comparison is apposite speaks to the excellence and philosophical insight of our speaker today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Joshi as he lectures on the Epistemic Commons.
Thanks so much for that really kind introduction, and really glad to be here and talk about this topic, one that I'm very much interested in, and want to hear your thoughts about it. So what I want to talk about today is really, so the university and the epistemic commons, and the epistemic commons is kind of my way of putting this idea that we're epistemically all kind of in it together. So knowledge is a kind of shared enterprise. We don't do it alone. We're not like tigers or leopards in that way. We're kind of very social creatures. And as social creatures, it's not just that we kind of rely on each other for our material needs. It's also that we take most of what we know as testimony, right? We trust others, and we're really interconnected in that way. And what does that mean for what we can know and what we can be justified in believing? And this is really something that I think John Stuart Mill is also interested in, and I kind of pick up on as well. So, okay. Okay, great. So I want to step back and, as David mentioned, kind of think about what the university is for. Why bother have universities in the first place? This is, of course, tied to our shared pursuit of knowledge. But one way of thinking about the university is it solves what is called a public goods problem. So what are public goods? Think of something like clean air. Clean air is a public good. And public good, the way economists talk about it, is that it's non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So my benefiting from clean air doesn't take away from your benefiting from clean air. So it's non-rivalrous in that way. And everybody can benefit from clean air, so it's non-excludable. Okay, so goods like this, and we can also think about roads, unless they have tolls, but like regular roads, they're public goods, right? Everybody can access them, and it's non-rivalrous. Okay, so goods like these are notoriously underprovided by the market. So if you leave it to market forces, you're not going to get, you're going to get an undersupply of things like roads and clean air. So In the case of clean air, that's our problem with climate change, right? Everybody has an incentive to pollute by consuming or by producing in certain ways. But if we all pollute, we're kind of are in this suboptimal situation. So that's where kind of the scope for kind of government intervention comes in. Okay, so it solves what are the public goods that the university provides? Well, think about science, basic science, right? If there weren't such things as something like universities and probably publicly funded in some way, it wouldn't make sense for an individual to like try to work on some abstract problem in chemistry, right? There's just no bang for the buck there in that way. So if we left it to the just pure market forces, maybe we would get certain R&D in engineering or pharmaceuticals, but we wouldn't get this kind of basic science and scholarship. So that's one thing that the university does, is it provides a kind of public good in that way, which is science and scholarship. Okay, and there's also a couple of pedagogical aims we can think of. I mean, ideally, we want citizens that are equipped to think critically. So that's part of what going to college is about, hopefully. And also as professionals in society, right? Okay, so these are some of the public goods that the university provides. And we can think about how government support is kind of justified in that way. So there's this one interesting problem, which is that all universities are to some extent funded by, or at least subsidized by the government. So even Boston University, which is a private university, but the government kind of subsidizes it partly through subsidized student loans and research grants and so on. So this raises this question, well, what merits that funding? And one way we can get at this is, again, markets left to themselves would underprovide this important good, which is scientific and scholarly activity. Okay, and so there is, so this idea comes from Adam Smith, where he talks about one of the core functions of government, taxation, is to provide these public goods which make us all better off, right? So bridges, roads, they make us all better off. If we didn't have bridges or roads, we couldn't get anywhere. But it's not in the incentive of any individual to provide, right? Okay, so that's a kind of way of just thinking about why, as a democracy or liberal democracy, we bother having universities and we bother funding them, right? Okay, so this raises a question, though. How must the university be structured? So this gets to the end of the university, the telos. Not any public good goes, right, in terms of when we're thinking about a liberal democracy. So what must the university look like in order for this public funding to be justified? So we can think of a range of public goods that we would intuitively think that's not justified for funding within a liberal democracy. And again, liberal democracy means it's a pluralistic democracy, so we have to justify these public goods to everybody, right? Okay, so here's some, we can think about examples in the Q&A as well, but here's some examples, I think. Like, okay, so you want to build a large statue, let's say, that of a divisive figure, like we're going to spend $50 billion on building this huge statue. You'd think, okay, from a liberal democracy perspective, like, this is not kind of, doesn't merit tax funding. Again, part of why this is a philosophically interesting question is that taxation is coercive. It's necessary, but it's coercive, and so it has this kind of bar of justification that private funding might not. So if you're a private individual, want to go build this statue, go ahead, right? It doesn't need that same kind of level of justification. Okay, another example would be projects that advance the goals of a particular religion or creed. So think of like building a huge church or huge temple of a particular religion. I'd say, okay, that should be left to private hands. We shouldn't use public funding to promote kind of sectarian goals or of particular religions or creeds or whatnot. Or building a center for astrology. Again, why not astrology? Well, partly we think, okay, again, private funding is one thing, but since we don't think of astrology as a kind of robust field of inquiry that's geared towards truth, at least that's my biased opinion. But okay, so we might not want to fund that through tax dollars. Okay. Okay, and universities are special in another way. When we think of general public goods, just think about roads and bridges. These are kind of decided on by our representatives, and we vote for them, and those representatives are democratically accountable. Universities are interesting because they're not democratically accountable in the same way. So the people of Massachusetts don't get to vote on who the chair of sociology or chemistry is, right? And maybe I'm not saying that's not the right way to do it. Of course, the people of Massachusetts on a whole probably don't have the expertise on deciding who should be hired as the next chemistry professor. Okay, that's all fine. But on the other hand, with great power comes great responsibility in this way. So then this creates this fiduciary duty that professors have and scholars have. And this is what I want to turn to next. One way of thinking about fiduciary duty is doctors and lawyers. So doctors have a fiduciary duty to their patients. Lawyers have a fiduciary duty to their clients. And likewise, I think scholars and academics, administrators similarly have this fiduciary duty. Okay, so let's think about what the fiduciary duty would be. In the case of a doctor, it's fairly straightforward. It's restore a patient's health, and we can say a bit more about what there's a whole field of professional ethics around medicine and law, so I'm just glossing over very quickly here. Lawyer also has a fiduciary duty, and one reason why fiduciary duty is important here is that the patient or the client is in a kind of vulnerable position when it comes to the doctor or lawyer. So the average client might not know anything about the law, right? So the lawyer is the kind of legal authority that's going to help them, and so they're in this vulnerable position. So likewise, I think, so we might think about what the fiduciary duty of a scholar is. It's hard to say exactly like how to fill in this blank. I mean, we can talk about this in Q&A as well. But one possibility is to kind of back up and think about the institution as a whole. So think about medical institutions as a whole. The goal is public health, right? So again, going back to the telos or the end of the university. Legal institutions, the goal is justice, ideally. Okay, in universities, I think at least one of the aims has to be something like truth. And that's the way in which we can justify this spending to everybody. We can justify this institution to a broad, a diverse liberal democracy where people have, this is one of the key problems of liberal democracy, right? Yeah, you have a population that disagrees on a lot of things, ideology, religion, some people are atheists, some people are religious, some people have different political ideologies. How do you justify an institution to everybody in that way? Because it's publicly funded and it's a public institution in a way. Okay, one analogy with legal institutions that I think is particularly helpful, you think of, okay, what is the lawyer trying to do? Well, you might think, okay, the lawyer is trying to promote justice, but that's not quite the way of thinking about it. That's not how the system is structured. Each lawyer is trying to defend their clients, right? They're trying to make the best case for their clients. They're not directly trying to promote justice or something. But the idea, the hope is that so what matters here is the way that legal institutions are structured, right? And the structure has to be right. And there's certain ways in which we've structured legal institutions that hopefully create justice as a kind of emergent thing, emergent phenomenon. Of course, it's never perfect, but at least we can approximate something like justice. And we have a certain kind of objectivity that we try to embody in the legal institutions. One is that each side gets a hearing, so each side gets a defendant, a lawyer defending each side or a legal team. And this is a way of trying to guarantee or trying to promote objectivity. Judges and juries are distinct, right? So, and juries are meant to be peers, so they're meant to be a kind of random selection of the population. So you mitigate kind of possibilities for bias and corruption and things like that. Okay, so the legal system has to be structured in a certain way in order to promote justice. And then there's a question of how must the university be structured so as to promote truth, insofar as truth is our goal here. Okay, and one kind of simplistic way of thinking about objectivity here is just thinking about individuals. So you want to say, okay, we want an objective scholarly enterprise. Well, if each of the scholars working in it are objective, then we get objectivity, right? That's one way of thinking about it, right? So you want physics to be objective. Well, think, is each physicist, are they doing honest work? Are they not plagiarizing? Or are they, using the proper methods? We add that all up, we get objectivity. Well, Helen Longino was a feminist philosopher of science. She said this is a bad way of looking at things, partly because we're bound to be, each of us is bound to be non-objective in some ways. We all have our biases, our perspectives. This is kind of a truism in a way, like we all come to the table with certain assumptions. So we're all kind of subjective creatures. None of us can be like objective in a full sense. Yet presumably at least the well-functioning sciences are objective. You think like physics, chemistry, photonics, these kinds of sciences that have been remarkably successful, they're presumably objective. Okay, and she says the way of thinking about the objectivity of science is not like the objectivity of individuals, but rather the objectivity of science as a social enterprise. So it's only because it's structured in a certain way that it can be objective. And the things she emphasizes are that sciences must be open to transformative critique, which means it must be possible for people to question certain basic assumptions and kind of try to disprove any hypotheses that are held. And also she emphasizes diversity of viewpoint. Why is diversity of viewpoint important? Well, there's a lot of kind of psychological literature suggesting that we're much better able to recognize the mistakes on the other side with respect to certain assumptions that we don't share, right, than our own mistakes. So if you have a diversity of viewpoint, ideally people can check each other's mistakes. Okay, so she says actually only if the products of inquiry are understood to be formed by the kind of critical discussion that is possible among a plurality of individuals about a commonly accessible phenomena can we see how they count as objective. Okay, so the objectivity comes from the structure of the enterprise, not just aggregate a bunch of objective individuals and then you get objectivity. Okay, so here's the problem then. One problem. We want universities ideally to be objective, right? If we want these to be kind of publicly funded and authoritative institutions, we want them to be objective in some sense. We want them to be, one way to put it is we want them to be robustly truth tracking. We want them to aim at the truth, and if there's a kind of, if they veer off, we want it to kind of converge to the truth ultimately, even if there are small deviations. So we want this to be robustly truth tracking to merit public funding. And one way you can bring this out is thinking about whether institutions like the Cato Institute or the Heritage Foundation ought to be publicly funded. One worry people might have is like, okay, it's fine if private, and this goes back to some of the earlier points, it's fine if private individuals are funding Cato Institute, which is actually how it is funded, or the Heritage Foundation. Just for people who might not know about these, Cato is a kind of libertarian think tank. So you're not going to find, so it's mostly populated by libertarians. You're not going to find many Marxists or socialists in Cato Institute. Likewise, Heritage is a conservative think tank, so probably not going to find many liberals of a certain sort in heritage. You might think, okay, look, in a liberal society, you get to do what you want. You get to spend your money how you want. If a donor wants to fund the Heritage Foundation, that's fine. But there's a kind of sense in which I think a lot of people would be upset if the Heritage Foundation were receiving tax dollars, right? Okay, so why not, right? Why would we be rightly upset? I think, many of us would be rightly upset if this was tax funded. One thing to say is like, look, there is a sense in which maybe Cato and Heritage put out good research and so on, but there's one sense in which they're not objective, right? In one sense. They might not be robustly truth tracking because there's not a kind of as much diversity of viewpoint as we would hope within to merit public funding. Okay, so I just want to talk a bit about fiduciary duties and then get into the problem that I'm interested in and want to hear your thoughts on. Look, there's also a fiduciary duty to students, I think. So one thing to note is, as I mentioned, patients are in a vulnerable position to their doctors. I mean, the average patient might not know much about medicine, so they kind of take the doctor as an epistemic authority, right? Same thing to be said with clients and lawyers. I think the same thing can be said with students and professors. Here's a kind of interesting quote from okay, yeah. Okay, so just I see. Okay. Okay, so here's a kind of quote from Max Weber. He has this lecture from, I think it was 1917, called Science as a Vocation. So he's interested in like the kind of fiduciary duties of teachers and scientists and scholars. He says the true teacher will beware of imposing from the platform any political position upon the student, whether it is expressed or suggested. And if he feels called upon to intervene in the struggles of worldviews and party opinions, he may do so outside in the marketplace, in the press, in meetings, in associations, wherever he wishes. But after all, it is somewhat too convenient to demonstrate one's courage in taking a stand where the audience and possible opponents are condemned to silence. So this is his kind of way of putting this idea of a fiduciary duty. Okay, so I want to step back and just explore this problem further, this idea of objectivity and how, especially given that we're social creatures and we rely on each other for what we know, how should we think of like an optimally functioning scholarly community? And one that's objective in the sense that we want. Okay, so you might think, look, this is one kind of immediate objection we might have. Look, I mean, look at the journals, look at the scholars. Are they doing good work? They're not. Suppose they're not plagiarizing. They're not like making up data. They're using the proper methods. They're selected by rigorous, examinations and so forth. What's the problem, right? Why should intellectual diversity itself matter? I mean, this goes back to Helen Longino's point about viewpoint diversity. Why should it matter, right? And one kind of flat-footed question you might ask is like, okay, after all, we don't want flat earthers in the astronomy. You say you want intellectual diversity. Well, do you want flat earthers in a astronomy department? No. Do you want evolution deniers in a biology department? No. So, okay, so if you accept that, then clearly you think there's some limits to intellectual diversity. Would be a kind of natural objection that comes up. One thing I want to contend is this kind of underappreciates, and this is what I want to focus on in the rest of the talk. This underappreciates the extent to which scholarships in science are social enterprises. So, I mean, one way you can step back and say, okay, so we have fairly high trust in astronomy, and we kind of defer to the experts, about astronomy. We don't like do our own research about astronomy. You kind of defer to the experts there. Why is that? Why is that? And I think that trust is merited, right? Why is that? Well, one thing we might say is that it's well functioning in the sense that it's kind of it's the culmination of this fairly objective process where any and all hypotheses have been considered and refuted and so on, disconfirmed. Um, it's intellectual diversity of a certain kind that undergirds the confidence we might have in astronomy, and I want to explore this idea further. Okay, so here's this idea of knowledge, and this goes back to the theme of the talk as the epistemic commons. Look, we can't verify everything by ourselves, so in some sense we're in it together, and that's actually a blessing. I mean, we couldn't verify everything ourselves. We live in a society that's extremely marked by extreme division of labor, right? And this is something we can note in our professional lives as well. So we inevitably, even say one of you wants to become a lawyer, well, even in that you specialize, maybe you specialize in tax law or something. We don't do everything by ourselves. Like, imagine trying to grow your own bread and make your own car or something like that. We wouldn't get very far. But there's also a cognitive dimension to this. So we can't verify everything by ourselves. So we inevitably rely on others. Okay, so there's a sense in which there's a kind of collectively maintained stock of facts, perspectives, things that are alive within our community, the kind of sum total of knowledge, we might say. And there's this really interesting book by Sloman and Fernbach. These are cognitive scientists, called The Knowledge Illusion, Why We Never Think Alone. And they say something quite striking, which is, language, memory, attention, indeed all mental functions can be thought of as operating in a way that's distributed across a community according to a division of cognitive labor. Okay, but there's much intuitive ways of getting at this. So consider these. I believe there's a country called Brazil, but I've never been there, so I trust, people tell me they've visited there. I trust them, right? So I get that from testimony. I believe there's a planet called Neptune, never seen it, right? Believe there are electrons, never seen those. So okay, so think about much of our knowledge is kind of taken from testimony in this way, right? We're relying on others. I mean, the things that we can independently verify are like the things in our direct perception, and maybe certain a priori truths like 2 + 2 is 4 and so on. But for much of our knowledge, especially the a posteriori stuff, we inevitably rely on others. Okay, and here's W.K. Clifford. He was a philosopher / mathematician in the 19th century. He has this very striking quote where he says, there's a sense in which, again, our knowledge is common property. So it says, our lives are guided by that general conception of the course of things which has been created by society for social purposes. Our words, our phrases, our forms and processes and modes of thought are common property. This is key. So he thinks of this as common property, and I think it's useful to think of it that way. Fashioned and perfected from age to age. Okay, so here's a kind of idea then. Look, there's a sense in which we have a epistemic common, so that is the kind of collective stock of knowledge that we have. And then if it is fruitfully thought of as a commons, we can think about what degrades that commons. So anytime we have a commons, you have a potential for a tragedy of the commons. So consider the ocean. Well, that is a commons. It's a kind of common property of humanity, you might think. And it's vulnerable to overfishing. And the atmosphere you can think of as a commons. That's vulnerable to pollution. Again, we can talk about the way in which our incentives are kind of thrown out of whack by the commons problem. Okay, well, what about the epistemic commons? If there is an epistemic commons, what can potentially degrade that? And I think there's one thing that can degrade it. I mean, maybe it's not the only thing, but one thing that can degrade it is a certain form of social pressure. Okay. Um, and I think Mill in On Liberty is very keen on this point. I mean, he starts um, the essay by saying, look, I'm not going to try to convince you that we need something like legal protections for free speech. Like, I think you all will already agree to that. That's how Mill starts with this. But he thinks that social and professional pressures especially can be just as effective as legal sanctions. So if expressing certain opinions or sharing certain types of evidence means you can't get a job, well, maybe that's not as bad as going to prison, but it's pretty bad, right? So that kind of social pressure can act as a certain type of incentive. And what I'm interested in thinking about is, what does that mean for what we can justifiably believe? What does that mean for our collective epistemic condition? Okay, he has this very striking quote in On Liberty. Again, to think of Newtonian physics as a kind of very firm science, very successful science. I mean, he's writing this in 1859, so it's called Newtonian philosophy. He says Newtonian philosophy because everything was called philosophy at some point, but you can think of Newtonian physics, right? 1859, that's the kind of gold standard, right? So he says even if even Newtonian physics, philosophy were not permitted to be questioned, mankind could not feel as complete assurance of its truth as they now do. The beliefs we have most warrant for have no safeguard to rest on but a standing invitation to the whole world to prove them unfounded. So again, he's thinking of physics as a kind of fairly healthy discipline. It's fairly objective, as we were talking about. We rightly have high faith in Newtonian physics at the time. And he's saying, okay, the reason we can have this high faith in astronomy or physics or cell biology is that it is structured in a certain way such that, look, if you think Newtonian physics is wrong, come bring your evidence, right? Bring your evidence, make your arguments. So and it's because there is that openness that it's that makes us rightly trusting of Newtonian physics. So that's why we can be justified in believing in Newtonian physics. Okay, so this might seem like a fairly high bar, right? You might think as a fairly high bar, and there's a kind of fairly interesting kind of principle behind it, which is he's saying that in order to be justified in believing certain things, certain scientific claims, the social incentives have to be right. So this is, I think, an underappreciated point. You don't get an objective field of science or scholarship just by calling it science, right? It has to be the incentives behind it have to be properly structured. Okay, so if the social incentives are such that some claim cannot be questioned, that degrades the confidence we can have in it. So what Mill is saying is the more you say, okay, you can't challenge Newtonian physics, or here are some social and professional costs that we will impose on you if you challenge it, the more that is the case, the less we can be confident in Newtonian physics. And he means this as a general principle. It's not just about physics. Okay, so what are the effects of social pressure? I think this is a kind of underexplored issue. So under social pressure, I mean to talk about just any kind of pressure for isolation, or in the case of the universities, any professional pressure, and those can be a range of different things. But any kind of social pressure, and again, this is a kind of ecumenical term, what can happen, I think, is that it can cause reasons on only one side of the debate to pile up. So on almost, Mill mentions this in passing, but the idea is on almost any kind of complex claim, right, there's going to be evidence for and against. So think of something like 2 + 2 is 4. You might think, okay, well, there's no evidence against that. It's hard to think about, like, what is the case against 2 + 2 is 4, right? It's kind of okay, so maybe these kind of simple a priori propositions of mathematics, there's no evidence against it, so maybe math is a special case. But think of any other kind of claim, complex claim, especially social claim. So think about like some economic policy, was that a good decision or not? Well, there's going to be evidence for and against. It's not going to be like all the evidence points it to be a good policy, right? There's some indicators that might favor the other policy. There's some indicators that might favor this policy, and then ideally we have all the evidence coming out, and then we make a call, right? So we want all the evidence to get out there, especially about complex empirical claims, where all the evidence is not going to come on one side. Think of any kind of, especially social or economic or political claim. It's going to have evidence on either side, and maybe one side wins out when the total evidence is given, but we can only be sure of that if all the evidence actually gets out, right? Only then can we be sure. Okay, but social pressure degrades that confidence that we can have. So here's a process that can occur. So let's say that, so reasons on one side would get filtered out due to social pressure because of certain incentives. And then we might be caught in this tragic situation where we look at all the evidence that's made its way to us and we say, okay, that evidence supports P, let's say. Philosophers like to use these letters, but okay, so that supports P. But it might turn out, depending on the particulars, that if you take all the evidence into account, it might support the other side, right? So that's the kind of worry in the background there. Okay, well, what social pressures are you talking about? Are there any in the university? Well, different people have different stories, but here's some kinds of pressure that you might worry about. So suppose, let it be some kind of issue or topic or view of the world. Imagine you have a kind of social dynamic that looks like this. Most people are on this side, few people are on the other side. Maybe in the ideal world, like there wouldn't be any social pressures, but in reality, you start worrying about what kinds of jobs are going to be advertised, what kind of perspectives are going to be privileged in a certain way. And this is a kind of forward-looking incentive, right? So think about the graduate student who's deciding, here are 3 research topics I could do. What am I going to choose? Well, one kind of forward-looking incentive is what's going to get me a job, right? That's part of it. So that's going to be a kind of professional incentive or pressure. And you can kind of see how that can affect what evidence gets out there. Peer review, look, peer review is a process in academia where a random selection of people are chosen to assess your paper, whether it should be published. But if you have this kind of lopsided situation, you're going to sample heavily from this side, and so you're going to get some effects on peer review. Again, which ideas are pursued, how research questions are framed, this is all going to be kind of influenced by the composition that you see. Okay. So here's then the worry. If you have a filtering process, so if you have professional pressure of a certain kind, here's the kind of tragedy that we might be caught in, or could be caught in, if there are pressure. And I think this is what Mill is kind of talking about. Okay, so you have so what are these green and red dots? Well, the green dots, let's say, are evidence for some claim, and the red dots are evidence against that claim. It could be anything. Is economic policy X good, or is whatever it could be. Could be a range of things. So, okay, here you have this situation where the total evidence, and this is all that could be said, total evidence, suggests that red wins out, right? So there are more red dots overall than green dots. But there is a kind of filtering process. So this is let's say, the peer-reviewed literature or whatever. This is what is taught in classes or whatnot. And there's a filtering process, so we talked about the social pressure. So think of this as a kind of semi-permeable membrane that it lets in the green stuff more easily than the red stuff. And by the way, you can get this tragedy even if nobody's doing any, like all the scholars are using the best methods and they're doing honest work. They're, nobody's doing anything like, nobody's plagiarizing, nobody's doing any of that. Okay, but if you have this filtering mechanism, then you're caught in this situation where if you just look at the lopsided subset, you say, okay, green wins out, right? But actually, if you looked at the total evidence out there, maybe red wins out, right? And we can't be sure that green wins out in this way unless we're sure that this membrane is kind of equally permeable to the red as to the green, right? And only under that condition can we be like, all right, I have a subset of the evidence, but I'm still confident that green wins out, right? If you thought that this membrane is kind of, it's not selectively permeable, it's just, it takes in everything as it comes, then you can say, okay, I don't know everything, I don't know all the total evidence, but this I can be confident that it's representative of the evidence out there. Okay, so here's an example sampling from a jar. Imagine a jar contains 100 marbles. How much time do I have left? Like 10? 12. Okay. Okay. So here's a jar, right? It contains 100 marbles, and you draw from the jar. So let me fill this out. So it's shaken, and you draw from the top, and you don't see inside. You just kind of like blindfold, draw from the jar. Okay, and you draw 10 marbles from the jar. And then you look and you say, I get 8 blue marbles and 2 red marbles. Okay, now consider the claim there are more blue marbles in the jar than red. So you don't have the total evidence, because total evidence would mean you look at every single marble. You have a subset of the evidence. And it's 8 blue and 2 red. Then you say, okay, I don't have the total evidence, but consider the claim that there are more blue marbles in the jar than red. Even if I have a subset, I can be fairly confident that there are more blue marbles in the jar than red, right? And this is, in fact, how political polling works, for example. You can't poll everybody before an election, right? So you sample a subset, like 1,000 people or something, and you make a call based on that, right? But here's a modified case. Suppose now you learn that the red marbles are heavier, so they're weighted with iron filings or something. And then you learn that it's shaken up. Okay, now should you be confident that there are more blue marbles in the jar than red? I think no. I think you should just become kind of agnostic, because you could think, oh, maybe there are more red marbles, they just sunk to the bottom because of the iron filings. I mean, similarly, suppose somebody comes to you and said, okay, we did a poll of 1,000 people, the Republican's going to win. Because let's say 900 of those people said they're going to vote Republican. Okay, then you learn, all the polling was done in like rural Kentucky or something. It's like, okay, now you should take that with a grain of salt, right? Like, or to say, okay, Democrats going to win. All the polling was done in Berkeley, like, okay, California, right? So you want some kind of representative sample, right? So you don't want to bias subset, and this is something we kind of agree on in a range of cases. Okay, so I think this helps us make sense of what Mill was on about. And again, you might have this issues like, why do you care, John Stuart Mill, about like whether Newtonian physics can be questioned? Just look at the evidence, right? Like just look at the journal articles. Are there good arguments? Are they rigorously peer-reviewed? Or, like why do you care about this questioning stuff? And I think the problem with that kind of response is it really misses the import of unpossessed evidence. So we don't have all the evidence out there. We have a subset of it, and we want that subset to be representative in some sense. So there's a lot of unpossessed evidence out there, and there's two forms. One is maybe people could know about it, but they don't share it because of social professional pressure. Or it could be out there waiting to be discovered, but the incentives are such that you don't have the incentive to go on that research program. So just consider the case of Newtonian physics. Einstein came in kind kind of argued that Newtonian physics only true in approximation when you're not moving close to the speed of light, etc. Imagine if there was an incentive against questioning Newtonian physics, then Einstein would have said, oh, if I try to do this, I might not get a job or whatever, so I'm not going to touch that, right? Okay, so I don't know where this points actually. Okay, works sometimes. Okay, so here's a kind of objection to Mill, you might think, or this Millian perspective. And I think this is an objection that a lot of people might kind of worry about. Okay, maybe if we're all ideal, then maybe the Millian story works. But in real life, we're kind of biased creatures. We have motivated reasoning. We have range of prejudices or other kind of ways of motivated reasoning. Maybe with ideal epistemic agents, you wouldn't need any social pressures. But given that we're non-ideal, we're human beings, we're flawed in different ways, maybe social pressure can have a positive influence. Of course, I mean, you can talk about bad cases, but we shouldn't generalize from these bad cases. The bad cases being, kind of often talked about Galileo's persecution, or can look up Lysenkoism in the USSR. Okay, those are two bad cases, but look, there might be good ones too. We shouldn't generalize from these two bad cases or a few bad cases. Okay, so what assumptions must the Millian make in order to make the argument go through? Either John Stuart Mill or somebody sympathetic to this. One is that, look, social pressure is just this force we can't control, right? We should be skeptical that it can work in a good way. I mean, maybe in one-off cases it might work well, but overall, in general, once it's unleashed, we don't really, and especially because our evidential situation is so complex, we can't really predict with good confidence whether it's going to work well. And secondly, we're better at just assessing the evidence directly rather than assessing what kinds of social. So if we grant these two assumptions, I think the skeptic can be answered. Okay, so defending assumption one, Mill himself gives a kind of inductive argument about social pressure. So he says, look, we shouldn't always assume that the truth will win out when you have these processes of social pressure. And it's a kind of inductive argument based on history. Another bit of kind of research, and this is just, I'm not saying her story is necessarily true, but it kind of gives us a flavor about how we should think about social pressure. So this is Elizabeth Noel Newman, who's a German kind of social scientist. And she had this idea that, look, people are afraid of isolation, and so when they perceive isolation pressure from others, they're induced to self-censor. And this most occurs on morally laden issues. So probably this doesn't happen with respect to like photonics or chemistry or something, but more about morally laden issues. And over time, the silence opinion will disappear. Okay, so think of this process. It doesn't seem like this process would care about the truth, right? It's like this process has its own kind of dynamics of motion, and we shouldn't really expect that like the kinds of ideas we settle on based on a process like this are going to be necessarily tracking the truth. Okay, what does this mean for us? Again, spirals of silence are going to be sensitive to social forces, things like who's in power, who's more charismatic, who has more resources, and those need not necessarily align with the truth. Defending assumption two is this idea that, look, we're better at just deciding on the first order evidence ourselves. There's this idea that we have these capacities for epistemic vigilance, where we we have fairly developed capacities for epistemic vigilance, and we might be prone to motivated reasoning when it comes to our own reasons. So like, why are you late for lunch or something? Okay, then people are able to give excuses or something, even if there might not be good ones. But we're fairly good at assessing the reasons of others. So we should be more. I mean, the million might think we should be more optimistic about how people are able to decide on the evidence by themselves. Okay, I'll just skip over this. Okay, and one thing you might worry about is like, does this require an assumption of infallibility? Mill is worried about infallibility, and you might think, okay, well, if we're not confident about anything, right? Mill is kind of giving a skeptical argument, and so am I here. We're not confident about anything. Like, does that mean we're kind of paralyzed? We can't. We must act on. We must act on the total evidence we have. Would this be paralyzing? Well, Mill has this argument, like it doesn't. So he says we shouldn't presume ourselves to be infallible, right? So we shouldn't presume ourselves to be infallible. It doesn't mean never be confident about something. I mean, I'm fairly confident that the Earth is not flat, for example. It doesn't mean don't have high credence on that. It just means that, according to him, that we shouldn't undertake to decide for others what they should be allowed to hear. So again, this is an argument that let all the evidence come out and then we can make a call based on that. Okay, so you might think, okay, so I mean, in the background, there's a worry about to what extent a range of fields are structured in a way so as to track truth robustly. And I think at some level, I think everybody agrees that the incentives have to be right in order for us to be able to trust the outputs of that field. So here's a kind of extreme example. So imagine you live in this dystopian regime. It's called utopia. Imagine this is like 1984 or something like that. Okay, and the regime has certain ideology and so on, and has certain interests. Imagine there's a range of epistemic communities, let's say, scholarly communities. They're physicists who talk about how conductive certain materials are, and meteorologists who tell you about the weather tomorrow and so on. There's also economists. And here's one thing that you notice. All the economists of the last 10 years who've said, hey, the indicators are not as well as doing as well as expected, or like here's maybe a way to restructure the economy to boost production or something. And all those economists, you've never heard from them again. Okay, suppose this is the case. Okay, now now you're presented with a bunch of data from the economists. They tell you, okay, here's this data showing what the economy will do over the next year. And say you have no reason to think anybody's fabricating anything or anything like that. So it's just the data is, let's say, for all you know, accurate. Should you trust in what the economists say? Plausibly not, right? Because they don't have the right incentives. I mean, at least so on that level, we can agree that the incentives have to be right. Why? Because in this case, the economists have a fairly strong incentive to present that part of the story that is amenable to the regime in that case. Okay, so here's a worry, kind of going back to the university and to the scholarly community at large. You might think these areas, which are very kind of far away from morally and politically laden issues, are fairly robust in that sense. There's no incentive to privilege one hypothesis over the other, apart from what the evidence supports. So physics, chemistry, cell biology, metaethics is this kind of abstract area of philosophy that deals with foundational questions of morality and so on. Again, that's kind of removed from politically laden. or ancient history, like when did Caesar do X or something like that. Okay, so those are, I was told Larry was the last speaker, but he puts this fairly provocatively. So he has this idea that, so he worries about social science inquiry in particular and certain parts of social science inquiry. So he says some areas of social science inquiry are so closely linked in the public mind to sensitive issues of policy that an objective scholarly discussion of them is now impossible. The notion of objective research on the employment effects of the minimum wage, say, or the influence of maternal employment on child development can have no meaning if when the results are reported, other scientists are mainly concerned to pose the ad hominem query, just what kind of economists, sociologists, and so on would say this. So he's worried about forward-looking incentives, right? If you know that, like, okay, if you defend a certain hypothesis, you're going to get this, you might just, okay, I'm not going to touch that, I'm going to work on something else. But insofar as that's happening, you're going to get a lopsided set of evidence at the end. So then, I mean, this is I think a kind of deep worrying problem. Then you can't just look at that evidence and say, okay, this is what the science says, like this is the settled science, because you could only say that if you were fairly sure that the supply chain or the epistemic supply chain was like, it allowed all the evidence to come out. Okay, so upshot, maybe there's a tragic implication. I mean, this is, I think I'm sympathetic to kind of Socrates when he says, like, I know that I know nothing. Maybe on these topics, one kind of perhaps tragic implication is we just can't know much because the incentives there in certain areas of social science, because they touch on politically laden issues, the incentives are just never going to be maybe ideal in a way that polymer chemistry can be. Okay, so maybe one thought is like, okay, we have to be more doxastic, insofar as we care about being rational. And to be doxastic openness meaning willingness to revise our views, on these morally, politically laden issues, and kind of being less confident about our views in that domain. And some practical implications, again, if we think of universities as a publicly justifiable institution that has a goal that we can all share, right? I think in order to merit public funding, again, private funding is a different matter because people can fund whatever they like in a way. But if they merit public funding and kind of thinking of it as a public institution, a public good, they ought to reaffirm their commitment to truth as a kind of collective goal of research, and as a means to one, again for the reasons we talked about, take steps to promote ideally viewpoint diversity and combat viewpoint discrimination where it occurs. And that's it. Thank you. So I'm looking forward to
Thank you very much for a terrific lecture, and I imagine and hope that the audience has some questions, and we certainly have time for that. So because it's recorded, we'll use the mic, and remember to keep your questions as questions more than as comments.
Thank you so much for your lecture. So you talked a lot about truth, and in the beginning of your lecture, you talked a lot about fiduciary duties, specifically fiduciary duties of universities, and you said truth. And I just came up with these two questions. What exactly is considered true? Moreover, what is, in your opinion, the truth that universities are supposed to be striving for?
Yeah, that's thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I want to say something very kind of commonsensical in response. I mean, I think in a range of domains we consider there to be truths, right? So I mean, maybe just take kind of geology, right? We have truths like the Earth is roughly round. And that's a kind of truth that we discovered over time through various scientific processes. Yeah, or yeah. So we, I don't know. I don't have a kind of more broad theory of truth, but the thought is, okay. So we certainly have a kind of a commitment to thinking about there being some kind of objective truth. I mean, that's kind of presupposed by our scientific practices. We're trying to at least disconfirm certain hypotheses. So, I mean, there's various views of how science progresses. I mean, one kind of thought is that, look, it kind of disconfirms various hypotheses. So, 2,000 years ago, maybe the one living hypothesis was the Earth is flat, and over time we disconfirmed that. Yeah, so I mean, that's, I guess maybe one thing that your question is probably getting at is also, I mean, maybe with respect to morally and politically laden issues, it's like harder to a certain truth, right? And especially in humanities, right? So I mean, think of like what the English literature person does. Maybe it's hard to think about them as aiming at the truth in the same, or the art critic or whatnot is. It's hard to think of them as like aiming at the truth in the same way that the physicist or biologist is doing. Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question, and I think one thing to say is just going back to Helen Longino. So she has this point that so it's not just these kind of hard sciences that can be objective. We can think of like, can art criticism or can literature scholarship be objective? And I think there's a way in which we can think of it as objective if like a lot of different perspectives are presented and maybe the best arguments are made. So again, in philosophy, it's also, I mean, it's tricky to think about like what the truth is in that way, because I mean, I think most questions in philosophy kind of remain open, right? People give an argument for one side, then somebody comes and says, oh, this argument is wrong for these reasons, and then the next person comes. Okay, but so that process, and there's one kind of question about philosophy, like, have we made any progress? Have we found any theorems or whatever? I mean, the scientists have all this progress they can talk about, like, we found the atom and we, et cetera. But philosophers are like, have we proved that like moral truths exist or something like that? It's hard to say. But I think even in a domain like philosophy, I think it can be objective. So I think one of this is just my opinion, but one of the fields that is fairly objective within philosophy is, again, this field of metaethics, because it's so kind of abstract. And metaethics asks questions like, when we say something is wrong, like what are we saying? Are we expressing an emotion, or are we making a claim about the world? Are we expressing a claim that is truth-apt? And there's this and other debates, are moral claims subjective or objective? But I think metaethics is objective in that sense, because I think there's a range of opinions, and there's always an incentive to, if one theory gets too popular, there's always an incentive to come up with an argument against it, right? So it's not like one theory gets popular and then only that theory kind of survives. There's always an incentive within certain areas of philosophy to always kind of be the gadfly or be the critic. Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question, and I think in cases of hard sciences, I think we can be a bit more glib about it. Like, yeah, there's truths, like, it's cloudy today, that's a truth, et cetera. But I think in humanistic inquiry, I think your question gets really kind of interesting and challenging. But what I want to say is I think you can still be objective, even if you don't think of like, okay, we've established the truth, in literature or something like that. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi, for the lecture. I was wondering in your book, Why It's Okay to Speak Your Mind. You put at least some emphasis on the relative absoluteness or objectivity of science when compared to the philosophical fields. So I was wondering if you had any opinion on, say, the science of climate change or the moderation of COVID-19 research being politicized through different avenues of funding. Do you have a general opinion on that?
Yeah, yeah. My own view is that I think it seems at least that the science on climate change is fairly robust, and there's like tons of evidence that we can use to support the view that climate change is occurring, and it's a dire problem in many ways. Yeah. So, but was there more? Can you say a bit more about what you were thinking about the kind of politicization? I think I agree with you that both these things are kind of politicized, unfortunately. So you do and those are kind of sensitive to broader social forces, right? What gets politicized? There's a kind of limited bandwidth to what gets politicized because we can't politicize everything, and that kind of shifts over time as different things become more salient. But yeah, did you want to just say more about like what you're thinking about the politicization of it?
Yeah, I was just wondering how degrading it is to the epistemic commons because of the politicization.
Yeah, I want to say as a general matter, like to the extent that we think that, look, there is evidence out there, but it can't make its way to the mainstream channels, then, to the extent one thinks that that's true, that is a kind of reason to take down your opinion, take down your confidence on that specific claim. But yeah. Anyway, that's my thought.
It's a two-part question. The first part is, are you asserting that the university is the epistemic commons, or at least the most important one in society? For example, would Wikipedia be an epistemic commons? And I'm using Wikipedia as a metaphor, because if you think about the university in America since World War II, what today we call free market Chicago school economics, for decades, the social pressure was against it, not for it. The same is true with what we today call neoconservative social studies. 30 years ago was true about critical race theory. But in each case, they established their own journals, their own outlets. In other words, they begin to investigate what you call the, that subset that's biased.
Yeah, right.
And the second part of the question is going to be, if you do believe the university is the most important epistemic commons, in the long run, should we feel optimistic or despair? And the reason I ask is I think you can make an argument that from the Inquisition through McCarthyism to today, the university always succumbs to social pressure. On the other hand, if we go back to the Wikipedia metaphor, we do have a larger force field in which that funded institution operates. You see where I'm going?
Yeah, right. Like to what? That's a really great point and great question, and you kind of have to wonder, like, are any of these social pressures new? Right? These are there've always been these kind of social pressures. And one thing I want to say is, like, the social pressures definitely change over time. Like, what is, in Galileo's time, like the flatness of the earth was like, that was a kind of morally and politically laden issue in the sense that it was close to the religious worldview, and now it isn't as much. So what is the locus of social pressure changes over time. What I want to say about that is, like, we have to just kind of reflect on where the social pressures are at a particular time, and then if we notice that there are social pressures within broadly the academy against certain views, that kind of degrades the kind of confidence with which we might hold the settled or mainstream opinion in that respect. And yeah, just going back to this question of like how important is the university as an epistemic institution, and I love that you brought up Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is this kind of alternative epistemic commons. Like, so if you want to find something, it's very interesting because the first thing, if you want to look up something, the first place at least I go is like Wikipedia, right? Not. I mean, as a first for it, you don't look up like the latest journal articles. I mean, most of us are. I mean, if it's not our field, we probably can't even make heads or tails of it in different domains, right? So, like, read the latest article on like nuclear physics, I couldn't really lose thread after the first paragraph or whatnot. But okay, so Wikipedia. But I think, this is kind of, maybe kind of commonsensical, but I think the university is like extremely important because of the kind of role it has in our society broadly, right? I mean, one of the fascinating things, at least in modern society, is like, for a range of professional jobs, if you want to be in the Senate, if you want to be in the Congress, if for a range of professional jobs, or if you want to be a journalist, you have to go through the university, right? So you have to. It's not exactly optional if you want to break into certain professional jobs to have to go through the university. So in that sense, it's extremely important, because then it shapes the kinds of perspectives that then are alive within the broader professional kind of milieu. But yeah, I think Wikipedia is an interesting case because it has this kind of supplementary role where it's much more kind of democratic in a sense that anybody can contribute to it. But yeah, that is a kind of alternative epistemic commons that's interesting to think about. Yeah.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. My question sort of relates to politics degrading the epistemic commons. What sort of responsibility do we have to weigh how our search for more diverse evidence will affect like radical political thought, for example, or like this is also a question I had about Lowry's research. So to what extent do we have to weigh? Because you talked about intention being important, but to what extent do we have to weigh how our investigation will be influencing more radical and like effective and tangible realities in terms of like radical politics and stuff like that?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. So, this is a really fascinating question because in the background, I think we might worry, one kind of telos is just like go at the truth whatever it is, follow the evidence where it leads. When it comes to physics or sociology or whatever else it is, chemistry, right? Just truth is the overriding telos, and we gotta do whatever. And the other aspect of it is just this idea that, look, it's not just kind of aiming at truth. We should also be cognizant about like what, maybe this. The issue about the pandemic kind of ties into this as well. Like I think, one might wonder as well with something like the pandemic, which is very kind of rapid onset, kind of emerging situation, and people kind of initially didn't really know how best to deal with it. There's a kind of strategic consideration there too that might have influenced some people. Is like not just what is the truth and we get it out there and let people make their own call, but also like putting this statement out there, even if it's the truth, how might that be kind of received, or would it have bad consequences in the long run? So it's certainly possible. This is a kind of problem or issue for utilitarian or consequentialist reasoning is the consequentialist, just consequentialist moralist wants to kind of promote good consequences in the long run, then it's not obvious that you should always try to respond to the evidence, right? And this kind of, it's interesting, this kind of goes back to Pascal's wager, where he thinks most people might be familiar with this, but it's this, I think it's this deep question of whether, there's one thing about what we should believe given the evidence, and there's another question, what would it be good to believe, or what would it be good to act as if true? So Pascal thought, let's say there's a 50-50 chance that, certain religious beliefs are true. Well, if suppose they're not true, well then I don't lose that much. But if they are true and I'm not a believer, then I suffer eternal torment or whatnot. So from a kind of cost-benefit analysis, I shouldn't just go with the evidence. I should go with what has the expected positive benefits in the long run. And I think that's a really good question, because I think in general certain epistemic and practical kind of considerations can come apart. One kind of mundane example is if you're going into a job interview, you should probably kind of amp yourself up and increase your confidence, even if objectively you might not be the best candidate or whatever, right? So, so that's a kind of consideration there. I think with social phenomenon in particular, what I want to say, and what Mill again would want to say, is it's just too complex to predict, and we don't have we don't really have data on what truths should we put out there that could be misused or whatnot. So first of all, we don't have any kind of rigorous way to tell, it just makes things ripe for creedal interest to take over, right? So somebody might say, oh, you shouldn't say that, because that'll be policymakers or policymakers will use this in order to push this economic policy, which will be bad. So even if this is true, you shouldn't say it. I think one thought is it just kind of makes things ripe for people with certain sectarian interests to make to make claims beyond that which is kind of justified by the evidence. And the other thing is just, society is extremely complex, and our evidential landscape is extremely complex, right? So there's so many things that that scientists came up with in the 60s, which wasn't, or 50s, 60s, and so on, which wasn't immediately obvious how that would be used at that point, right? So just think of Einstein's general theory of relativity. It's when you first learn about it, it's okay, this is just abstract physics. How is this going to be useful? At least initially you might have thought this is not very useful, it's just an app. But nowadays it turns out, because broadly the Earth kind of bends space and time around it. If you don't take that into account, your telecommunications don't work, right? So we kind of need that kind of piece of evidence, even though at the time we couldn't have even thought we're going to be beaming signals across the world or whatever. That's not even, it's not even within the realm of possibility that people would have even entertained, but yet that general theory of relativity now helps us to make our cell phones work, Okay, so the point of that is just to say we're usually not in a good position to say okay, this piece of evidence is best left suppressed. Just think of what might the censors during Galileo would have been thinking, who cares whether the Earth is round, or what's that gonna, right? If you just let this guy go on, it's just gonna diminish people's faith in this, and there's various political, the kind of various political things going on. Maybe they would have thought the cost-benefit analysis is just to shut this guy up or whatever. But as we know over time, if we didn't have the conception of the Earth as round, a lot of a lot of the kind of science wouldn't have progressed in the same way. So anyway, so that's just to say that it's very difficult to tell like what pieces of evidence are going to influence some other field of inquiry that we might not even know about in the future, right? Because it's our evidential kind of landscape is extremely complex. So, thanks.
Hello, thank you for your talk. That was very interesting. I wondered if your understanding of the epistemic commons and the university's role in widening that or strengthening that, whether that presupposes the validity of a certain type of liberalism, and whether, if that's true, one, the university can truly accommodate radical views and afford to accommodate within that system, and two, if that's true, whether the university doesn't degrade the epistemic commons. And I say that because the university, by necessity, has to make decisions about who has access to those goods. And I mean, by my thinking, you know, one tragedy on top of social pressure would be the fact that to have a robust epistemic commons, people need access so that they can actually participate and strengthen that, which the university actually cripples at times. Thank you.
Could you just repeat the kind of question that you had? Yeah.
Sorry, I thought
Yeah.
that out very damn it. What part?
Oh, just the first part. I was just yeah. Could you just?
I guess in different terms, I wonder whether, like the mechanisms you've outlined for getting to a particular conception of a epistemological commons or truth, as you say, like whether that is presupposing a contingent foundation, which would be liberal democracy, and whether if that's true, like you can actually accommodate opposing views into that, or like just the contingency of that foundation and the university's role in that.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. Yeah. The question of liberalism. Yeah. So this is definitely I'm presupposing kind of liberalism and a particular kind of liberalism where I mean, I don't want to rest too heavily on this, but there's this broad tradition called I mean, even if it's not right in the end, it has certain insights. It's called public reason liberalism. So the idea is that any kinds of public institutions or government policies or public funds have to be kind of justifiable to everybody. And then the challenge is, as you're mentioning, within a liberal democracy, we kind of think of it as a pluralistic society, right? So you have a range of different people with different worldviews, and so one of the things that John Rawls, a political philosopher, kind of stressed is that we ought ideally to be kind of neutral as to the conception of the good. So each of us has a different conception of the good, or different communities might have different conceptions of the good, and so ideally we want to be neutral to that. And part of this project is working out like, okay, so if you don't have a liberal democracy, right, you're just kind of a sectarian state or an authoritarian state. I think that they maybe don't have the same problems, right? So they're not starting from this position of like, how do we justify this to everybody, or at least most people. So when it comes to, I mean, that's the liberal democracy assumption is really kind of driving this project, and thinking through, again, from the perspective of a liberal society where people are going to disagree about lots of things, right? Disagree about what is good in life, disagree about what policies we should have, like what policies are the best or what the government should do. From that perspective, what does it take to justify the university as a broad public institution? And I mean, one thing that I think most people can agree on, like, I think something like, again, physics or something is very publicly justifiable because of its kind of robust truth-tracking nature. We can justify that to a wide range of different conceptions of the good, and just something like roads or clean air, again, that's something you can justify to everybody. Regardless of your kind of particular views about the good life, you need to get from place A to place B, right? So you need you need roads for that. Like, can we tell a similar story about the university? And I think the more it's tied to tracking the truth, the more we can tell a plausible story in that way. But thanks.
So I'm going to ask a question that builds off and I think relates to that. So what about I guess I'm wondering about the difference, as you're imagining it, between something like Cato or its progressive analog and the university. And what if someone said something like this? Look, if you look at Cato, it is no less politicized or no less ideological committed than your median sociology department or your median English department. Only Cato's honest about its ideological commitments. And so the person says, well, given that, let's get rid of the university and let's change the scale of this so that we have lots of different institutions that may or may not be overtly ideologically committed. They're going to talk to one another. They're going to talk at one another. They're going to argue with one another. And then on this model, by changing the structure, we're going to arrive at something like what the university was meant to be. What do you think the merit of that possibility is? Or is there something about the university or the idea of the university that makes it a superior model to this sort of society-wide vision where you have the various constituents making their cases, and then the conversation is happening at just this very different kind of scale?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly, I mean, one of the worries that somebody might have, as you put it. I mean, just as the Cato Institute might be lopsided in one way, the median sociology department would be lopsided in the other way. And then this, again, brings back the question of, so I mean, there's two options. One is that, look, the median sociology department could take steps to intellectually diversify so that you have a lot of different, I mean, perhaps that would be ideal because there's also this pedagogical mission that the university has that Cato doesn't, and it's, I mean, a world where it's just, so here's a possible world, right? You have professional schools, or basic science programs, medical school and so on, that's within the university. And then all the kind of stuff about society or whatever, which, there's a worry that kind of ideological or creedal interest can creep in, just kind of make that a bunch of think tanks, and they can, private funders can fund as they like. There'll be Marxist think tanks, socialist think tanks, libertarian, conservative, liberal, and then let them just duke it out. Maybe they can talk to each other, or so that's a model. And one thing that would be lost in that case is just this pedagogical mission, right, where people wanting to kind of rigorously think about social issues or learn about various statistical methods and so on wouldn't get that training that they do in kind of modern sociology or economics and so on departments. So there would be something lost there. But again, I mean, there is this kind of worry in the background, right? So we wouldn't want to fund Cato publicly or Heritage publicly. So by those same reasons, does that undermine the kind of public funding of sociology departments? And that is a real problem. And so there are two ways to solve it, I think. One is to go that route, just make all the social thinking out in the think tanks. The other route is kind of an active commitment on the part of sociology departments or whatnot to kind of try to represent a kind of broad range of views, so that within the discipline you can have these kind of people of different perspectives can check the errors of the other side, and so as a result we would have kind of a literature that is more representative of the total evidence rather than kind of lopsided in that way. Yeah.
So my question is, what can be done? So you, in your book, you mentioned that institutions of knowledge production, such as universities, think tanks, and research labs, contribute positively to the epistemic commons. And significant progress has been made, especially over the past 2 decades, with the advent of the internet and the democratization of knowledge and information. But the point that sounds nowadays is that a significant population or portion of the world still does not have access to internet or the technology or cannot afford a university education. So my question would be, what do you think can be done to make these institutions of knowledge more accessible, and how much more progress can be made?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, it remains to be seen. I think some optimism would be like, kind of economic growth or kind of increasing. I mean, in the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of kind of economic growth, and along with it, access to education, and places like India, Indonesia, China a couple decades ago. So there's some room for hope that I think more people will get access to education and to the resources of the internet. Yeah, that's just a point of hope. So.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. So from your book and this lecture, you talked about the division of cognitive labor and how inherently we have to rely on the specialization of labor. Like, for example, we rely on a doctor, but that inherently makes you vulnerable because you don't know everything that a doctor knows. So for the average individual consuming everyday media, like the news, or like you said, think tanks, in your opinion, how should we go about consuming such knowledge, whether it be from a think tank or from a news media source like CNN or Fox or Cato and the Heritage? So how do you think we should approach that now? Because a lot of these institutions or knowledge institutions, as you said, can be skewed in their objectivity.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think the more we have reason to think that the various, again, in the case of the more hard sciences, we have reason to think that it's not like, is MIT skewed about physics? Probably not, right? I mean, they might have different focuses or whatever, but on the whole, we have reason to think it's not skewed. On maybe social political topics where I think a lot of the institutions are skewed one way or the other. I mean, Cato and Heritage in one way, and perhaps sociology departments in the other way. I think one thing to do as a kind of consumer of knowledge is to try to diversify one's sources in this context, right? In the context where there are kind of skewed epistemic agencies one way or the other. I think the best we can do is try to sample from a range of different viewpoints and perspectives, and then kind of have access to as much of the, again, like going back to the polling example, you don't want to just poll like rural Kansas, right? So you want to ideally poll all the rural areas and the cities and so on, so get a kind of wide range of perspectives and then make up one's own mind. But I think in this kind of environment, I think it's, at least as individuals, I think we do best to kind of diversify our sources. Thanks.
Thank you. My question is, and I think you talked about this a little, but the idea of like infallibility. Why do you think, and I think this is expressed more so in your book, but why do you think that our current time period is more infallible than those of the past? I have a second question, so I'll let you answer that one first.
So more infallible, can you just say a bit more? Yeah.
So I think in your book you were expressing how like today's age, like we're just more entitled in our own beliefs, and we often just kind of reside there. So why do you think that's a phenomenon that's happening today rather than in the past?
Yeah, I mean that's very interesting. I have one conjecture, and this is a kind of conjecture. I mean it certainly seems to me so one phenomenon that we've observed, at least in politics, is kind of rapidly increasing polarization. So like if you look at the median, say Democrat, and I mean this is tied to party politics, but I think it's not just limited to party politics. If you look at like in the 90s, you look at the median Democrat and Republican, they were much closer together. Even in the mid 2000s, they were fairly close together. And after, so Pew runs this survey. I think they did it like 94, 2004, or roughly around there, and then 2014 or so. And there's a massive spike between the mid 2000s to the mid 2010s. So there's a massive spike in polarization, and it's kind of gone further. I mean, this is a conjecture. So one thought is maybe like, maybe other forms of identity kind of went in the background. So like maybe people are less kind of tied to specific communities or specific faiths and so on. So there's much more kind of secular culture. And so one thought is like, and there's a million takes to be had on this, but one take is something like maybe over the mid 2010s, we kind of substituted politics as a big part of our identity, right? So you can see this on social media, people's handles and so on. There'll usually be some kind of political slogan there. So when somebody puts on Twitter, like, there's Twitter and then like a bunch of kind of political slogans, one thing that's suggesting is like that's part of their identity, right? They want you to see their profile picture, and the next thing they want you to see is not like, I love gardening, or, I'm like they want, so part of that is like, okay, we substituted politics as part of our identities more so than it was in the 90s or something. And then, there's just a lot of like literature on like when a belief becomes like core to your identity, you're much less critical about it and much less like evidence responsive about it. And there's a lot of work too on like how we have beliefs that we use as signaling mechanisms. So, this goes to like research on like how, just to back up, we're kind of like tribal creatures in the sense that like we evolved in kind of small hunter-gatherer groups, right? So if you're a tribal creature and you're kind of, your tribe is kind of rival with other tribes, you have to figure out mechanisms by which to like get a strong coalition going, right? Like you're a coalition, you're against the other tribe. And one way in which we might have coalitions is to have certain beliefs, right? So everybody on this coalition has these beliefs, right? So by you having that belief and you affirming it as part of your identity, that lets me know that you're on the same team. So that's part of the function of that belief. Now you might be worried, is that really a belief, or is that like just something you say? I think there's some research to suggest that those really are beliefs. So people really do believe these kind of beliefs that are important to coalition sustaining. But when you have a belief that's important to your identity and coalition sustaining in that way, it's just less responsive to evidence, and you're going to be less, like as a tribe member, you don't say, well, yeah, this, but there could be some evidence against. That just that's not as good for binding people together, right? If the function of certain beliefs is to bind people together, you need people to be gung-ho about it. So this goes back to one question: has this been around forever? I think it has been. It's just like, its focus shifts over time. So, there have been polarized atmospheres and as long as humanity has existed. But I think, so it's kind of focus shifts over time, and it seems to me, at least, that the last 10 to 15 years, let's say 10 years, focus has kind of shifted to politics as a way of like carving out a kind of identity. Anyway, so thanks.
Okay, I know one segment of the student population needs to go, so feel free to excuse yourself, and then we'll have one last question once these folks have had a chance.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I have a question about epistemic trust and reliability. I wonder how it seems like we're in a situation where trust in institutions like universities and governments and their choices of funding, these are all areas of our society that are questions in terms of their reliability of their decision making and the aims in which they pursue. And where you have those who are arguably constituents of those institutions or potential beneficiaries are no longer trusting of the ability of the university to be aiming at truth or the objectivity of the university or therefore the truth claims. And so this seems like a real present issue and also a theoretical issue, and so I'm wondering how you would respond to that kind of issue.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great point, and that's the kind of worry in the background, right? I mean, there's a question like, under what conditions is trust merited, right? We want to trust. I think almost everybody trusts their doctor on a range of things. Though I mean, in the case of COVID, there was some issues. But I think most people trust their doctor. You know, they get a bacterial infection, they'll trust their doctor, whatever antibiotics they prescribe, right? So there's a lot of there's trust in a range of kind of epistemic communities and epistemic authorities. There's a deeper question of like, what does it take for trust to be merited, right? And I think what it takes for trust to be merited is some kind of objectivity, and that objectivity is not, I think, just a matter of perception. To the extent that a certain kind of epistemic community is more objective, they deserve the trust of the population. And it's interesting because I think, as you point out, recently there's been a kind of, I don't want to say collapse, but at least a marked decline in trust of. I think it's noteworthy because I think a lot of the trust fall has been, though again, I mean, I think that's why the climate and vaccine are very interesting questions, where there you have this kind of politicized topics. But I think a lot of the trust, the collapse in trust, has not so much. I don't think like chemists are like facing a kind of crisis of trust, right? I think people across the political spectrum broadly trust chemists, broadly trust doctors about like, heart surgery. I'm not going to do my own research, right? You are going to trust your doctor, I think, but really a broad segment of the population. It's not just like, there's no like generalized distrust of epistemic authorities in general, especially with, you can see this with medicine, people trust their lawyers for a range of things. But I think in certain politicized, areas where there are questions that touch on kind of socially and politically laden issues, I think the trust has gone down. So you mentioned, maybe sociology as an example. I think the trust in the outputs of the media and sociology department will probably show a fairly marked partisan divide. And I think the best way to remedy this is really to try to embody objectivity, again, by having a kind of more diverse range of scholars that have different perspectives and that can check each other. I mean, there's really, just going back to Longino, again, even if each of the scholars within a particular area is doing their best, there's still a limit to what you can do with that, where everybody's on one side and there's nobody on the other side to. This is again a John Stuart Millian point where, and again, it's borne out by a range of research. Again, if you look at Democrats and Republicans, for example, each side is much more able to spot the mistakes in the reasoning of the opposing side. So there's a range of experiments people have done to show this when it comes to logical or statistical reasoning. If you disagree with the conclusion, you're much more able to spot the mistakes in the logical reasoning. Whereas if you agree with the conclusion, even if the kind of logical form of the argument is not valid, you're much more lenient with it. You might not spot the mistake. Okay, so because of features like this, I think it's hard to get objectivity and merited trust to the extent you have kind of lopsided population of scholars. But yeah, thanks.
All right, let's please thank our speaker, Dr. Joshi. And thanks to all of you for your excellent questions. Please join us for our third lecture, which will be Dr. Chad Wellman on the permanent crisis of the humanities in a couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. I really enjoyed the questions, so thanks. Thanks for coming.